My name is Andy Smerick, and I am a resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. So thank you for being here for this event in particular, but also this is our grand opening week here at AEI. So we're thrilled that you got to be a part of like this new site. We want to be a hub for activity for the best thinking and ideas and people and consumers of information. So hope you get to come back a whole lot more in the future. I work primarily on K-12 education, and as I think about it, the foundational issues undergirding, call it domestic policy, things like civil society and decentralization and nonprofit groups and pluralism and so forth. That's why this conversation we're having today is so important to me, and I hope important to you as well. Because on one level, this conversation about campus politics is about institutions of higher education. It is about campuses and hundreds of billions of dollars flowing through them, and students, and about faculty, and the temperament, the disposition that's created by that environment. That's all true. But it also reflects and influences something much deeper, which is, do we actually still believe in the pluribus part of e pluribus unum? Do we actually believe in democratic pluralism? Do we think that it's great that people have different cultures and histories and viewpoints, and that they live them out, and that they can come into spaces ostensibly like universities that are about the free exchange of idea and mix things up, and most importantly, never have to worry about being viewed as a heretic? That is, not assigning yourself to a certain orthodoxy. Because it could be the case that our universities aren't just inculcating young people in a certain worldview, they could be reflecting something that's going on. And that could be unhealthy for the polity if we have gotten to this point where we don't believe in differences of opinion, where we think that parochialism is always bad and so forth. So there could be no better, let's call it core for this discussion, than this brand new book. And we are so fortunate, John Zimmerman, Professor John Zimmerman, is the author of Campus Politics, and he is going to present to us on this, his new book, and the contours of what's happening right now. What is going on actually on university campuses? There's a lot of talk, some of it signal, some of it noise, and give us a sense of like why that matters. After that, he'll probably talk for 15, 20 minutes. We'll give him a whole lot of leeway. It's a really good book. I commend it to you. Then I will come back up here with David French and Greg Lukianoff to have a conversation about this. We will bat around a handful of ideas. You probably know David from National Review Institute. He has litigated on these kinds of issues for quite some time. He has been in the trenches. And Greg is the president, CEO of FIRE, which probably is unquestionably the leading organization for like in the weeds working on campuses and free speech issues. And not incidentally, I'm a fan of his because he co-wrote what I think was the best article of 2015 in The Atlantic, The Coddling of the American Mind, about this. And it's fascinating. One of the parts of John's book is that there's an increasing emphasis among folks on the campus saying that the safe spaces and certain ways of talking about things, it's good for mental health. There is this alternative argument, I think Greg and maybe all of us will get into, that could actually be the exact opposite. That what we're doing may actually inhibit people's intellectual growth, may increase anxiety, depression, and some other things. It's definitely worth diving into. After our moderated discussion, depending on how forward-leaning all of you folks are, if I can tell that you're eager to get into the conversation, I'll move to Q&A pretty quickly. We just have a couple rules. One, please make sure that you raise your hand and we get a microphone to you. We just want to make sure everyone can hear you. Make sure you introduce yourself. We'd like to know who the conversation is happening between, so name and organization. And then last but not least, please actually ask a question during the question and answer phase. We are trying to model good behavior here. This is a conversation about discussion. It's a conversation about difference of opinion. As my Army friends would say, it's about being on receive, not just being on transmit. And so we're going to try to do that. So if you get the microphone and you get 5, 10, 15 seconds into your statement and I just see like exclamation points or semicolons on the horizon and no question marks, I may insert myself and figuratively pass the mic to someone else. Now, for those friends that we have who are watching live stream, and this is being live streamed, you can use the hashtag, or anyone in the audience here, campus politics, if you want to use Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, or I'm 40, so there are other things I probably don't even know about that you could be using right now. You can tweet at me, at Smerick, or at AEI, or at AEI Education. We'll try to keep up on all that stuff. And we even have this neat little feature now. So those people watching at home or from their offices, you can submit a question if you'd like, and I even have a device in real time to keep up with this. So if you go to sli.do, sli.do, and then just enter the code AEI event. All you got to do is enter your name and a question, and I will get a copy of it, and then sometime during our discussion or the Q&A, I will try to put those into the bloodstream so everyone can be heard. Sorry for the long throat clearing. I'm almost done talking. So order of operations, I hush up. Dr. Zimmerman comes up, talks about his book, moderated discussion, Q&A, and then I promise to get you guys out of here and on your day by 10:15. Sound good? Thanks so much, guys. So please join me in welcoming our valued guest, Dr. John Zimmerman.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks to Andy and Kelsey and the AEI for welcoming me to this gorgeous new home. I mean, this is how God would have made the whole world if he had the money, actually. It's just beautiful, and thanks to Andy for his lovely comments in praise of my book. He may be actually the first person who's not a blood relative to read my book. I'm not sure about that. You know, the very first book that I wrote when I was a naif, a much younger man, somebody gave me this 800 number that you could call, and allegedly it would describe how your book is doing. And again, being a naif, I actually called it, and I put in the 800 number, and I got the ubiquitous robo voice, and it said, "Good morning. You have sold 0 books today." That wasn't getting me any closer to God, so I haven't done it since. But my brief message here is that, first of all, nobody is being silenced, okay? We've got to be really careful in the words we use to describe the free speech problem. Thanks to Greg Lukianoff and other people, we have a very good sense of what that problem is, and it is real. But we've got to be really careful about the terms we use to describe it. There are 4,000 places to get a BA in the United States, and at most of them, trigger warnings, microaggressions, safe spaces, say what? I mean, it's not an issue at all. People haven't even heard those words. If you saw the Times last week, they ran a great story about LaGuardia Community College in the wake of the elections, and all of the trauma and all of the safe space discussion that you see at campuses like mine. It was totally absent from LaGuardia. People were just trying to get through their day, okay, take care of their kids, pay their tuition. I have extraordinary freedom. Nobody has silenced me, okay? As a historian especially, to call what's happening McCarthyism, I find offensive, okay, and actually an insult to the very real suffering that happened under McCarthy. However, okay, there has been a narrowing of debate and discussion on our campuses, especially our elite ones. And there's very good survey literature that documents this. So they do studies where they ask students, is it safe to hold unpopular opinions on this campus? And at the elite schools, a declining fraction of kids say yes through college. That can't be good. Okay, so as you go through college, fewer and fewer students say, yes, it's safe to hold unpopular opinions. And when I was researching this book, frankly, I was surprised at the wide range of opinions that people hold but don't express. For example, it turns out, and this was astonishing to me, that 40% of full-time faculty in the United States oppose the use of race in college admissions. 40%. I was hugely surprised to hear it was that much. I should tell you, for the sake of honesty, that I'm in the 60%. But I was ashamed to learn this because what it means is the people that disagree with me aren't actually speaking up very much. And I don't think that can be good for affirmative action or for the university. Is there such a problem as political correctness? There absolutely is. But I think there again, we have to be very, very careful in the words that we use, and especially in the ways that they define them, or we define them. So I've argued that there are actually two kinds of PC, one that I support and one that I despise. Okay? The first kind of PC is the one that creates very strong social, although not legal, taboos on the use of highly offensive terms. I do not think it should be illegal for Donald Trump to call women pigs. I really don't. Okay? But I think there should be strong social prohibitions and taboos on that. And if that's PC, count me in. Again, I don't want to ban it, okay? But if we as a community want to be a community, we've got to have certain community standards. And I think not calling women pigs should be part of those standards. I don't think calling women pigs adds anything to our discussion. Okay, I think, again, there should be strong social, not legal taboos on it. And if that's PC, count me in. The problem is the second kind of PC that doesn't taboo words, which add nothing to our discussion, but taboos ideas, right? If 40% of the faculty is opposed to race-affirmative action, race-based affirmative action, and we're not hearing from them, that means that there's a serious PC problem. Not the PC problem that prevents you from calling women pigs, but the PC problem that prevents you from actually engaging in what's one of the most critical and important debates in our society about the use of race in admissions. That kind of PC we all have to oppose, because that inhibits us as educators, as learners, as human beings. Now, why? How did all of this develop? Very briefly, because I don't want to talk too much. What I've argued in my book is that, and this is picking up on work that Greg and John Haidt and others have done, the real problem is the rise of psychological language, idioms, and metaphors for discussing politics. To be very clear, I'm an advocate of psychology, and I'll be very honest with you, there's mental health problems in my family, some very serious ones. My family has been a huge beneficiary of mental health services. I'm not opposed to psychology, all right? But I am opposed to the use of psychological idioms for discussing politics. Because one of the things I try to argue in my book is that psychology and politics don't play well together. If you say that you were hurt or injured or even traumatized by something that I've said, I frankly think that's a conversation stopper. I don't have a lot to say to you in response. I certainly would never say to you that you weren't, because unlike the Puritans, I can't look into your soul. You know, I don't know what you were feeling. I would never deny it, and I don't deny it. What I do question, though, is the use of feeling as a barometer, or especially as a playing field for political discussion, because I think it inhibits it. And I do think that's very much a function of our own time. If you look, for example, at the history of the term microaggression, it's fascinating. It was coined by an African-American psychiatrist at Harvard whose name was Pierce, Chester Pierce. But nobody knew anything about him or it until the 2000s, when it was revived, this term, by a guy named Daryl Wing Su, who teaches at TC, a teacher's college. And I hadn't really read his work before I got into this project, and it's been hugely influential. What Sue has done is he's written these books, these compendiums of microaggressions, and the microaggressions take various kinds. One of them is the kind that highlights your difference in an allegedly offensive way. So, where are you from? Okay. If like Daryl Wing Su, you grew up in Oregon and your parents are Asian Americans, you might be offended by that. It's like, dude, I'm from Oregon. I mean, yes, I'm Asian, right? But I'm American. So that's one kind of microaggression, okay? The one that highlights your difference. But then there's another kind that erases it, according to Daryl Wing Su, saying to somebody, you know, when I look at you, I don't see race. That can be a microaggression too. Because allegedly, all right, it denies your difference rather than highlighting it, okay? Or the one that's been most controversial, anyone who works hard enough in America can make it. Okay, this too, Sue has said, is offensive. Now let me be clear here. I can frankly imagine contexts in which all of these statements could be offensive. Definitely. In fact, given the right context or the wrong one, I might be offended too. What I question is a university, and especially a university administrator, which is what I'm getting to, in a prima facie way, declaring that these statements are somehow taboo. That's context free, and that's evil, okay? For a university administrator to make a statement about social mobility, which is really what we're talking about with respect to the last microaggression, anyone who works hard enough can make it. That's one of the most controversial questions in American social science, in American letters. A university administrator should not be laying down a rule about that. But that's the other crucial context for understanding this. The rise of psychological idioms is one of them. And the other one is the rise of the administrative university. Friends, here's an X. And if we're talking about race and race controversy and race culture, that has a certain kind of meaning, right? Malcolm X, the X on the hat, okay? But I want to encourage you to think about another X, which is the institutional context for this whole discussion. This is the full-time faculty. This is the full-time administration. And starting in the 90s, they cross. So when I was a kid, there were more faculty members than administrators. And now, there are more administrators than faculty. And that's a hugely important context for understanding all of this. Now, just to be clear, I'm not against university administrators. In fact, I was one, okay? We need them, all right? Secondly, there are often some very good reasons for the rise of administrators. And going back to mental health, the whole mental health apparatus, which when I was a kid in the 70s was very small at the universities, it's now huge, right? You don't get that by snapping your fingers, right? You're gonna have to hire counselors and staffers and psychiatrists and all that, right? I'm not against that, okay? But, all right, what I am against is trying to create administrative solutions, all right, and especially administrative directives surrounding highly controverted public questions, okay? That can't be good. It can't be good for any of us. So thanks to Greg Lukianoff and others, one of the things that we've discovered as administration rises, so do speech codes, even in the face of court decisions rendering them unconstitutional. So do diversity trainings. If you look at the demands of students in the last round of protests, you see that 2/3 of them focus on this thing called diversity training. You see the rise of these things called bias response incident teams. These are all managerial solutions. And I should tell you, as an academician, they also have an incredibly weak academic base. So take diversity trainings. Look, I'm not opposed to the idea of trying to help people converse across their differences, including their racial differences. I don't think any good-hearted person would be opposed to it. But when we look at and we try to study the managerial efforts to improve or change people's attitudes on the question of race, the academic research base is tiny. So this guy named Jim Sidanius, who used to be at UCLA and now at Harvard, he spent a lot of time when he was at UCLA studying this. And he would take thousands of freshmen and he would follow them through college, interviewing them, testing them. And what he found is the interventions on the part of the university, these multicultural and diversity trainings, he couldn't show that they had any effect. This seems to me a highly, not just managerial response, but a symbolic one. Hire a chief diversity officer, create a diversity training. By the way, it's expensive. Just want to throw that out there, right? As a parent of 2 young adult kids, I'm rather sensitive to that question. What actually does seem, by the way, to improve people's racial attitudes and especially their likelihood to have friends and lovers across races? Having a roommate of a different race. To my mind, Western civilization began to decline when the students were allowed to choose their freshman roommate. I think that is the worst thing that's happened in Western civilization. Because lo and behold, if you go onto Facebook and you're allowed to choose your freshman roommate, turns out you choose somebody that looks exactly like you. Yeah, we went to summer camp together, we have friends in common, blah, blah, blah. So you're not actually leveraging the benefits of diversity. I believe in Bakke, I believe in diversity, I believe in certain forms of race-based affirmative action. And if we allow the kids to choose their freshman roommates, we're actually not leveraging those benefits. Let me say just a couple other things about, and then I'm going to shut up, about this question of psychology, which I think is so central here. The genealogy of trigger warnings is fascinating and very different from the genealogy of microaggressions. Microaggressions has a dweeby academic genealogy. Trigger warnings has a much more populist one and actually came from the feminist blogosphere. Right when the internet started to hit, feminists started to argue that content on the internet that refers to sexual violence especially should have a trigger warning. Because if people who have been victims of sexual violence encounter that content, they'll be re-traumatized. The problem is that it's now come to cover almost anything that might upset you. So, we have demands for trigger warnings, anything about pregnancy, anything about addiction, anything about bullying, anything about suicide. My favorite is there should be a trigger warning if a professor shows a clip of Downton Abbey, because there's all that stuff in Downton Abbey. There was actually a situation where a student asked for a trigger warning in a horror films class about blood. And I'm like, dude, this is an elective. And it's an elective called a horror films class. Maybe you shouldn't have elected this course. But, to be clear here, just like all of this stuff, there are times and places where it may be totally appropriate. So one of the courses, the big undergraduate courses I teach, is about the culture wars in the United States, which is something I've written about. And I do a segment about pornography and anti-pornography, in which in the past I've shown an anti-pornography movie by a former NYU colleague, a terrific movie actually called The Price of Pleasure. And one of the things that makes the movie so compelling is it includes some porn clips, because it's trying to show how nasty, violent, and misogynist a lot of porn is. So before I show that movie, I always say to the students, listen, this is what you're going to see in this movie. And if you don't want to watch it, you don't have to. I don't call that a trigger warning, but for all practical purposes, it is. And it strikes me as entirely legitimate, right? It's just when you start to stretch this to cover any possibly upsetting incident. So, I won't bore you with the examples because you can find them in my work and also in Greg Lukianov's work, but here's the real problem to me. These psychological idioms, in addition to not really allowing for discussion or often stopping it, they also teach us, I think, to respond and feel in a certain way. So sociologists have been talking for about 30 years about something called feeling rules. This goes back to the work of Arlie Hochschild, who wrote this very famous book in the 70s about actually stewardesses. The focus of the book was how social groups and social situations teach us to feel a certain way. Okay? We're all subjective beings, okay? And we all feel differently. But at the same time, the feeling rules that surround us can bias us to feel in certain ways. Not determine it, it never determines it, but bias our feelings in certain ways. And that's what I fear this language of psychology is doing. The more we talk about the trauma we've experienced from, a Trump sign, which is what happened in Emory, the more likely we are to feel that. A great episode that I think highlighted this problem and a great response to it. You may recall that up at Harvard maybe a year and a half ago, there was this act of vandalism at the law school where somebody broke into the law school and put black tape over the mouths of the portraits of the faculty of color. And this led to a huge contretemps, and there were people demonstrating outside of Harvard Law School, and again, talking about how profoundly upsetting this was to them. And Randall Kennedy, who teaches at Harvard Law School, an African American, he wrote a really good op-ed that made 2 points that I think are very salient to this discussion. The first one was, we don't know this was a racist act. It certainly could have been, you know, but maybe the person who did this was actually doing a piece of street theater in which they were trying to call people's attention to the way that people of color are muzzled, right? Or bring more attention to the issue, maybe. Or maybe it was like an awful, terrible David Duke type person, right, that really was a bigot, okay? But then Kennedy says, and if it was, come on, how traumatized are we really? We're at Harvard Law School. Amidst all this talk about racial privilege, how about a little talk about Harvard privilege? I mean, could somebody who was, quote, traumatized by this piece of theater or this piece of awful racist vandalism, could they, with a straight and unembarrassed face, go to a Syrian refugee center or go to a battered women's shelter and say, you know, I was traumatized too. I know where you're coming from. I just don't think that they could. On the administrative side, and then I will shut up, I think it's really important historically to emphasize that for most of our history on campuses, students and administrators were at loggerheads. The history of the American university is actually a profoundly conflictual and sometimes violent one. You go back to the 19th century, okay, and there were duels on American campuses, and most of all, there were food fights. The students loved to do that, okay? At Oberlin, which was obviously the center of all sorts of important social movements in the 19th century, including feminism and anti-slavery, Sylvester Graham instituted a bran and water diet, only bran and only water, that led to massive riots and protests at Oberlin against the administration. You've probably heard of Sylvester Graham because he, of course, is the guy who started the Graham cracker. That's where it comes from. This was a very, by the way, barbaric and primitive time before there were marshmallows and s'mores. It was I don't know how they got by. But the point is, into the 1960s and 70s, there's huge tension between student protesters and administrators. So if you look at, say, the free speech movement, right, and at Berkeley, starting in the early 60s, you find Clark Kerr, himself a very mainstream liberal Democrat, calling Mario Savio, the leader of that movement, a university hater. That was Kerr's position about Savio. That's very different from today. If you look at the most recent round of protests, what you find is the administrators embracing the protesters. Oh, yes, you were right. I know you were traumatized. We've failed you, right? That's what Peter Salovey set up at Yale. So yes, we'll create speech codes. Yes, we'll have diversity trainings. Yes, bias incident response teams. Yes, we'll find the culprit in every single sexual assault case, okay, and dole out exactly the right penalty, because that's what we do, okay? We can do anything, okay? So more rules, more offices, more trainings. It's important to ask how people can grow up on those terms. Seriously, we're not the angry, biblical parent of the in loco parentis days. We're like the helicopter mom or dad, okay? We run the place, okay? The students are constantly asking for more administration, and we give it to them. And that, I think, is what really differentiates this generation of protests from earlier ones. Tom Hayden died recently, and I wrote a column about him. Very complicated figure. And if you look at the Port Huron statement, which is kind of the classic early statement of student protest, which, of course, Hayden drafted, it has a really interesting language. It says we need to wrest control from the administrative bureaucracy. And that seems like it's from another era, because it is, okay? Now it's, can we have more administration, please? Can we have another statement from you? There was an awful racist incident that happened on my campus recently involving terrible emails sent to African American students, right? And everyone is asking the president to say the right words. Oh, President Gutman, please say these mystical words. Say the right incantation. In closing, if you really want to see how different things are, go ahead and Google the Wellesley College graduation of 1969. Because at that graduation, that was the first one that a student spoke, which is kind of interesting. Okay, and you already know her name. It was Hillary Diane Rodham, later to be Hillary Rodham Clinton. If you look at the speech, it's really interesting because she says, we need fewer curricular requirements, we need a pass-fail system, and most of all, we need students to direct their own education. And she writes, Hillary, we're searching for more immediate, ecstatic, and penetrating modes of living. We're all exploring a world that none of us understands. It's such a great adventure. I think it is, actually. I think it is still a great adventure. None of us know where it's going. But at our universities, we will narrow that adventure if we continue to think of it in narrow psychological terms that restrict what we say and what we think. Most of all, we'll narrow the adventure if our students and our faculty invest ever more power in the people who run these institutions instead of in themselves. Thanks a lot. Cool.
Yeah. Take our seats up here.
I'm going to walk very carefully up here. Don't slip. Yeah.
So I have lots of questions, and I want to get David and Greg to be able to weigh in with their thoughts initially. But I just have to ask all of you, if you don't mind just responding to this. The administrative question is the thing that stood out to me in your book. It wasn't always this way that administrators seemed, like there's even a quote in your book along the lines of, in every single instance, it seemed like the administrators bent over backwards to say, yes, yes, you were right, we were wrong. How did that happen? Is it a different type of administrator who now is going into the office? Is it a difference with fundraising? This seems to be like a change in type.
Definitely, and I want to hear the other two gentlemen talk about this, but let me just say a couple things historically. I mean, I think one thing you have to think about is you have to think about the expanding role of the federal government in education, right? And what that does to the university is it just requires it to hire more administrators. I mean, think about the whole Title IX revolution. Again, none of this is necessarily bad. Sometimes it's very good, right? But if the federal government is more deeply involved in the university, by definition, you're going to need more administrators to figure out how to comply with the federal government, right? I think though, more broadly, there's also been a huge change in the sensibility of the students who see themselves as consumers very often, rather than necessarily as learners. So one of the things that I've been struck by in debates I've had with students on my own campus about my book is a lot of them say, look, we're paying the bills. If we want trigger warnings, why shouldn't we have them? And the bills have gone crazy. And that's a really important thing. I'm not justifying what they say. I'm trying to explain it. Given how much you pay for this product, I understand this consumer sensibility. I do not like it or approve it, but it does make a certain kind of awful sense.
Very interesting. Dave?
Well, first, I really enjoyed reading your book. It was very reasonably written, and I couldn't help but think, am I reading this in 2016? Because I haven't read anything reasonable in months.
That's a ridiculous remark.
Sad.
You know, I think that on the question you ask about the rise of the administrative bureaucracy, look, I was in law school from 91 to 94, which was sort of the crest of this first wave of political correctness. And all of the pressure from the students was to the administrators saying, give me, give me, give me, give me. Until later, to greater or lesser degrees, students have been doing that ever since. So there's just this constant push towards the administrators. But what I would say, to be very clear about, is that when we're talking about in loco parentis, or more precisely in loco helicopterus, the helicopter administration is not there for all students. It's not. If you are a conservative Christian, member of a pro-life club, Christian organization, you have views that are outside the mainstream on same-sex marriage, for example, you tell me how friendly that administration is to you. How much are they really going out of their way to try to make sure that your psychological well-being is taken care of? What you will find is the administration is going to go out of its way to make sure that all your other classmates' psychological well-being is taken care of as a result of the trauma you inflict upon them. And you'll see this, and it's not necessarily censorship, although that does occur, and I have sued quite a few universities who've censored religious student organizations. Censorship, out-and-out censorship, is less common than sort of just two sets of reality. And one of the things that I would say, if you're talking about free speech on college campuses, here's the question that you would need to ask yourself. Before I speak or say something, how much intestinal fortitude do I need to say the words that are going to come out of my mouth? And we have set up, particularly in elite universities, where an awful lot of speech on one side of the spectrum has sort of a glide path to expression. You're going to be encouraged by your professors. You're going to be encouraged by your administration. If your chosen political candidate loses, you're going to get an opportunity to go to a Play-Doh room. You're going to have the opportunity to vent your spleen. If you're on the other side, the administration's going to write a statement about how traumatizing you are. The administration's going to talk about how deeply troubling your speech is. And we're not talking about just radical fringe communication here. We're talking about extremely mainstream points of view expressed by millions of Americans. Now, that's not an excuse, and I say this all the time when I speak to conservative students. The opposite of political correctness is not, and pardon my language, assholery. There's an awful lot of people who believe, well, I'm going to strike a blow at political correctness by being the extreme worst person I can think of. And this goes to a point that you raised sort of at the beginning of your remarks, and you said there's a kind of benign form of political correctness and one that isn't. And I would say there's manners. As a son of the South, there's manners, and then there's political correctness. And manners is when you have manners, you're seeking to treat another person the way you would like to be treated. And to the extent that you know that the other person that you're interacting with has particular sensitivities or a particular background, which would lead you to be sensitive and compassionate in your communication with them, be sensitive and compassionate in your communication with them. If, however, you know you're talking to someone who's tough as nails and can take anything you dish at them, well, maybe you're going to feel a little bit more free. It's common sense. And one last thing that I would say, this language of trauma and this language of victimization and the psychology and this conversation stopper that says that if you continue to speak, you're harming me, it's just not evenly applied. If it was evenly applied, speech would just shut down on campus. I'll give you an example. I was at Penn late last year, and I was speaking about free speech on campus, and I was addressing this very issue. And a student spoke up, and they were from the inner city, Latino student, and they were talking about, because I touched on issues of race and affirmative action and things like this, and I'm in the 40% that does not believe in the race-based affirmative action. And he explained with great emotion that it's difficult to hear me talk about these things because he's from a historically disadvantaged area. He's from a low-income part of the country. He knows people who have died on the streets in gang violence. And who am I really to speak about this? How can I have an opinion about this when I didn't? And so I responded and I said, do you have an opinion about the Iraq War? And he said, absolutely, I have an opinion about the Iraq War. And I said, well, I'm a veteran of that conflict. I was there during the surge in 07, 08. It was the most traumatic experience of my lifetime. It's hard to imagine anything more traumatic. and I've seen more death in that 1 year than I hope to ever see in the whole rest of my life. Do you think someone should be entitled to oppose the Iraq War in a conversation with me? Or does my experience and the pain that I experienced there trump any opinion that anyone has? And in my presence, should they keep their opinion completely to themselves, lest they trigger me or lest they bring up trauma? And you could see this sort of, well, wait a minute, but I'm really anti-war. I really want, that's really what I want to say. So these things are not evenly applied. Not all trauma is the same. And so, we do not have a environment where what's good for the goose is good for the gander, so to speak, if I may use gender terms like goose and gander. And so that's why, to a lot of conservative students, this notion that the university is taking care of its students just flatly rings hollow. It's just seen as absurd.
Thank you. Greg?
I don't even know where to begin. There's so much to cover. Obviously, since he cited my work quite a bit, I agree with Jonathan on quite a bit about the situation on campus. I've seen 3 major phases on campus, and the first sort of age of political correctness was, frankly, before my time. And I was at a school that wasn't that affected by it, and it was towards the tail end anyway. I didn't realize when I started at Stanford at law school that they had just lost, that only 2 years before, they had lost a court case in which their speech code was defeated, even in a private school, because the state government got so angry about it, they passed a law called the Leonard Law, saying that even non-sectarian schools, they meant Stanford, can't have speech codes. So for most of my career, I would want to be talking to conservatives, for example, when they had this really kind of a sense of the really emotional student who desperately wanted censorship and was obsessed with identity politics, I was sure that that person existed, but it just wasn't what I was dealing with for most of my career. Those seemed like tall tales from the late 80s, early 90s, which was kind of before my time. And so most of my career has been fighting administrators who sometimes are engaged in political correctness. But I do get a little frustrated with the political correctness, people being so fixated on it, partially because some of my cases aren't really political correctness cases at all. They're just abuses of power. One of the worst cases, period, that I've seen dealt with a university president at a Georgia college who decided to kick out without due process a student because he was critical of a parking garage project.
Yeah.
Now read about this
I've
case.
referenced that in the book,
It's a crazy case. But then again, there are horrifying political correctness cases, like I talk about in Unlearning Liberty, a book I wrote back in 2012, like University of Delaware, where it was administrators engaging in this incredibly aggressive indoctrination program that really went way beyond anything that I'd ever seen. But so I feel like my career has had 3 phases. One, primarily administrators run amok, because someone always has to be running amok, of course. The next is the federal government run amok, coming up with standards, for example, for harassment that are literally impossible to comply with, at least if you want to be keeping with the Constitution. The standard enunciated about harassment in a 2013 letter is laughably unconstitutional and impossible to comply with, and necessarily, as David points out, has to be applied with deep double standards, or nobody would be allowed to say a thing on a college campus. But the third stage, which is distressing to me, but it's relatively recent, is seeing what looks like all these stories I heard about, which is this very strong, it's usually got a strong element of identity politics, but a lot of times it's also, white liberals, saying, I don't want this person speaking on my campus. And then, of course, people say, well, it's their special day, so commencement, and I always point out, well, okay, first of all, that's not a very persuasive argument to me. But second of all, this also includes speakers being, that they're not even probably going to go to Charles Murray's speech, but they still don't want Charles Murray speaking at that school because it offends their very sensibility that he even steps foot on campus. So I've watched a lot of these stages, and I want to get back to the way you introduced the section. And I thought it was great that you started talking about pluralism. I think anytime you pass anything like a speech code, you are making a very narrow statement of culture. I think you're basically saying our culture, this Harvard campus culture is superior. And meanwhile, I was a hellion at Stanford because I was always pointing out, wow, it's weird. All these acceptable views tend to sound like the views of white liberal Bay Area rich people. And they hated me for pointing this out, but I was always pointing this out. I'm like, so class has kind of fallen out of the discussion, and I think and that's one of the reasons why you don't see microaggressions, trigger warnings at
LaGuardia Community College.
At LaGuardia Community College, at a lot of these other places, because these tend to be signs of sort of class stratification. And I just finished Robert Putnam's Our Kids. Definitely read it. But for the elite colleges, it's a 14-to-1 ratio of whether or not you're going as a rich kid if you're going to go to one of the elite schools as a poor kid. And I think that universities have become so lopsided in their ideology, they can't see, in some cases, administrators can't distinguish what they think a good person should say from absolute truth. And I always refer back to my father. My father is Russian. My mother is British. You can't have two people who have more different cultures within and still remain within Europe. But my father would always teach me that the first rule of dealing with other cultures or people who aren't like you is to try to figure out where they're coming from and what their norms are, not to impose your norms immediately on them. And as my father would explain in non-PC terms, if you don't, you're acting like hick. And what I see going on today is this. I nearly called Unlearning Liberty the New Victorians because I see a lot of parallels between the Victorian era and this very self-confident idea that, well, conservatives, they're backwards, and evangelicals, they're just completely wrong-headed. They somehow managed to square that other religious minorities have similar beliefs to evangelicals, but that's okay because that's multiculturalism. But we know the end of truth, and we know the way people should talk, and it is getting away from this pluralistic model where it's okay to have quote unquote wrong beliefs, where we actually value that, where it's becoming a much more this is what all right-thinking people think. That's only possible due to sort of the heterogeneity of the student, the professoriate.
Yeah, let me just say I've read about Greg's background. It does remind me of the old joke that the British don't know how to say hello and the Yiddish don't know how to say goodbye. To go to what David was saying earlier, I actually think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes what we say might hurt people's feelings, but at the same time say that can't be the playing field and that can't be the barometer.
Right.
It should be possible to acknowledge those feelings instead of wheeling them away, but make an argument for why they shouldn't rule the day. Mm-hmm. So in the question of race-based affirmative action, I can well understand how if you were a member of minority group, you might be offended by an argument against race-based affirmative action. I get it, right? But I don't think your offense should prevent us from discussing the question. Right. So rather than say, don't be offended, you can be offended. I can understand why you might be offended, all right? But we can't use that as a measure of when and how we speak. Right. That seems to me just a fundamental distinction. And I'm afraid that we have lost it. And I should tell you, quite frankly, I've been very distressed at my own campus that when I make pleas for including more people in the discussion, including people that voted for Donald Trump, I'm met with comments like, it's just too soon, people are too hurt. They need time to heal.
Yeah.
I mean, just a purely psychological response. And I can tell you again, just for total sake of transparency, I am appalled by Donald Trump. I mean, I yield to nobody in my outrage at the things he said.
Did you almost run for president?
Yeah. Maybe one person.
I think you might be standing next to someone who.
I mean, nobody.
He gets a lot of death threats over.
But not a majority, but close to a majority of the voters did vote for him. Mm-hmm. There are a small number of people at Penn who voted for them. Some of them have appeared in my office and have told me that they don't feel like they can say that.
Oh, yeah.
And friends, that I cannot tolerate. Mm-hmm. If somebody wants to disagree with something I've said or written, I'm fine with that, because that's about me. And I'm a tenured full professor. I'll be fine. You can say whatever you want. Friends, the things I'd have to do to get fired, I can't even say. I mean, that's how bad they are. Okay,
They can be read two ways, by the way.
Yeah, I got no problems and no complaints.
Right.
Okay, but if I hear from a student that she or he feels like they can't say what they're thinking, that's war.
Yep.
That's war to me. Okay, because that cuts to my fundamental beliefs about what a university is or should be. And what I'm doing, I don't know if this will work, but I've been in contact with a couple of Bible colleges near Philadelphia to try to create a few seminars involving people from Penn and people from the Bible colleges next semester, just talking about the election. Because I don't feel that Penn internally will really be able to have what I call a conversation. Most of what's happened recently is not a conversation, it's a morning session, right? It's just different analyses of what went wrong. And I've been a part of that too. I mean, I think things went terribly wrong, to be honest. I've engaged in that conversation, but I'm ashamed at how few Trump voters I've had discussions with. And I don't think I can have those discussions internally at my university.
Well, and one thing that I haven't said this publicly before, but John Haidt and I have just signed with Penguin Press to do a book that's sort of taking coddling of the American mind as a starting point and getting deeper into this, because we thought we'd said everything we needed to say on it, and then the universities went much crazier in the year after we wrote it than we ever saw coming. And we're very serious about this, the idea that this is based on a bad psychological model, not one that isn't in keeping with the actual current research, but actually is precisely the opposite. You don't, like, I put it this way to students. You don't, if you were to go to a psychologist and he were to take you by the shoulders and say, you're very, very fragile, and if you hear things that bother you, you're going to be done forever. That psychologist would be fired. But to a degree, I feel like we are creating this, which is actually a psychological term, we're creating this self-fulfilling prophecy of fragile students. And I do think it is one of the reasons why, and it's empirically demonstrable, that we are seeing upticks in rates of anxiety among college kids, and students increasingly going to seek psychological help for oppression. Now, I say this because I also take psychology very seriously, but I don't want it to be abused into something that, and this is the tentative title of the book, it almost certainly won't end up being the actual title, but ends up disempowering students and making them feel like they're fragile, making them feel fatalistic, making them they feel like they have no choice. But as far as things that really frustrate me that have been generated by the culture currently on campus is what I refer to the exquisite technologies. And what I mean by that is it used to be back in our day in college and law school that the way to dismiss someone's opinion was to call them a conservative, and if you could figure out a way they were conservative, you're off the hook for really having to listen to them.
Right.
Now it's exquisite how many different arguments we have for not having to listen to each other. When you work if you go deep into privilege theory, 100% of the entire human race is privileged. You don't have to listen to a single person you disagree with. Mm-hmm. There is punching up and punching down. There is victim blaming. There's argument, mansplaining, argument after argument after argument that doesn't actually get you to the argument. And we've tolerated all of these things, and that's the emotional reasoning too, saying that I'm offended. That's a statement of an emotional state. It's not a substantive argument. But I think this is happening, across political lines as well. That we're figuring out ways to not talk about the actual issue. But I do think, on particularly the elite campuses, they're becoming experts at this way to never actually get to the substance of the argument, and I think that's inherently really destructive.
So that's. Do you mind if I?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say one quick thing, because since his name came up. So I don't know if anyone else, I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but I've actually conducted diversity training before.
Oh, goodness.
As a
How did that make you feel?
I felt oppressive. So as a JAG officer, when the military changed, repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there was a mandatory stand down across the military, and we were going to train our troops about same-sex marriage and LGBT issues. So can you imagine me? I'm being asked to run through this PowerPoint that is all of this sensitivity training and all of this diversity training, and I had to do it. It was orders. And typical military diversity training, it begins with a general looking in the camera. You will listen to this, and you will behave in accordance. But here's what happens when you...
They can order people. I mean,
Yeah.
they desegregated before the rest of us.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
So here's what happens when you deliver diversity training. And I tried to be as engaging as I possibly could be, and the whole crowd is like this. Whoops. The whole crowd is...
It's very dramatic.
They cannot wait for it to be over. They just hate every second of it. And
Please get me back to the war.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what happens on college campuses. A whole lot of people sitting through these trainings just going, and the only thing that they're getting from it is this view that you're telling me is the approved view. Uh-huh. It's not the view that I necessarily have, and it's not necessarily the view that I'm going to adopt. Mm-hmm. And so, one thing that we've learned in this election is people cannot be hectored out of their beliefs. Mm-hmm. They will sometimes send their beliefs underground, and then they'll share them in the anonymity of the voting booth. Mm-hmm. I live in a precinct that went 72% for Donald Trump, and guess what, guys? It's a great place to raise a family. Mm-hmm. It's a great place to raise a family. It's not, Trump's America is not some sort of hellhole, but it was an awful lot of people who just were really sick and tired of being told what to think and what to do, and were actually voting as a sheer act of rebellion. Mm-hmm. Just a sheer, complete act of rebellion. I cannot tell you how many times I heard that. So a lot of what's happening on college campuses is not achieving the effects. And I think one thing that was interesting about your book is you showed through actual data that colleges aren't quite indoctrinating quite as much as people tend to think they are.
That's the biggest myth, by the way. Yeah. First of all, it's a myth that the faculty is just full of radical Marxists, right? We are overwhelmingly liberal, like myself, but not very radical. That's number one. But the students don't agree with us on a whole bunch of different issues, right? If we're trying to indoctrinate them, we're doing a really crappy job. It's just not working, and in part it's because some of us aren't invested enough in teaching. Mm-hmm. Right? The whole indoctrination model implies a lot more investment in teaching and learning than either the faculty or a lot of the students exhibit.
Yeah. Okay, I want to make sure we do this housekeeping thing. If you're the online audience, remember you can submit questions going to sli.do and using the code AEI event. Submit questions, and I'll get to those in a second. But a bunch of you have raised issues related to a question that I wanted to ask, which is the influence of this, whatever we want to call this atmosphere, this environment, both on students and on the faculty. So I've read a couple times recently that it's anecdotal, but a sense that too many students now, and the term is can't answer the second question. Mm-hmm. They are so unaccustomed, they're so accustomed now to shutting down debate with a whole lot of different techniques that when you get to these tough questions about what is inside and outside of pluralism, what is good for democracy and what is not, they just have not been pressure tested in the discussion.
Yes.
So we've actually inhibited their growth. But now the faculty part is even more interesting. I just read this article in City Journal. A guy named John Tierney wrote in the past week or so. It's called The Real War on Science. The case that he makes is that actually the orthodoxy on campuses is affecting faculty in such a way that it is very clear that there are certain questions you can ask and you cannot ask. There are certain conclusions that you absolutely cannot reach, and that is having an influence on the research that's being done and on the faculty that is willing to go onto campuses to work. So the environment, I kind of worried, what is that going to do 20 years from now? Now I'm starting to wonder, what is it doing to the research and the students in the moment? Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. John Haidt's my co-author for the book that I'm writing and the article, and he wrote this incredible article along with people like big names in psychology, including Philip Tetlock, Jose Duarte, 6 different co-authors talking about how badly the political skew of social psychology was actually hurting the field of social psychology. And he gave the example of a paper that got published that basically just treated conservatism as necessarily a mental disorder. And it gave different, and it was so loaded because it gave sort of it showed examples of the questions, and they're all kind of like, do you think it's this kind of mental disorder, or do you think you have this kind of mental disorder? It's like, is there any options in which conservatism isn't a mental disorder is the question. And I do think that, and it's one of the things that John, I think, is one of the reasons why people listen to him, is he's talking, he's not saying that you need to have perfect parity, he's not talking, but he does think that the lack of disconfirmation, the lack of someone to call BS on when you're in a polarization spiral, where basically your confirmation bias. I've talked to 20 smart people, they all agree with me, I must be completely right, and I'll go even farther. Just having one person to disconfirm seriously can make a big difference. But I've noticed this in students too, is that when I go to campus, they don't know the second argument. I might agree with them on different political issues. I consider myself a political liberal, but I'm shocked at how bad they are defending traditional liberal talking points because they've never actually had them challenged.
That's a remarkable thing. That's like non-trivial if we're talking about serious about debate in campuses and what they're supposed to do, critical thinking. Have you noticed that as a teacher?
I have, but again, I agree with what Greg is saying, and obviously I wouldn't be here if I wasn't concerned about it. But I also think that we need to just be a little bit more tempered, right? One of the great things about teaching in most environments is when you close the door, you can do whatever you want. Most jobs aren't like that. And there's a problem with that too, right? Because some people aren't doing very much or doing something that's actually quite bad, right? But you have an extraordinary amount of independence, And when I was a K through 12 teacher, I would often just say, you know what the best sound is? And I would just close the door, And so, I've found in the recent round of debates at Penn that, frankly, the only students and faculty members who've been highly critical of me are people that don't know me, that aren't in my classes, to whom I'm really just a cartoon, just like some white guy whose sideburns are going gray, right? I mean, rather than, an actual human being. Because I've been able to conduct in my own classroom all kinds of debates. We can do that. That's the freedom that we have. Now, I would agree that because of these different strictures and developments that people might be less able to do it. And as far as the war on science goes, that's real and it's bipartisan. How many liberals in Boulder, Colorado, who scoff appropriately at climate change denial don't vaccinate their kids? A lot. A lot. And so, the war on science is real. It is bipartisan, okay? And the prejudice against conservatives is real, right? One of the things I've found so interesting about reactions to things I've written is how I get labeled a conservative. And this I just find hilarious. Friends, I was in the Peace Corps. My dad was in the Peace Corps. He knew JFK. I'm Jewish, I have a PhD. I am the most predictable dyed-in-the-wool Democrat ever. Ever that's ever existed. So it's kind of hilarious. But it's depressing too, and here's why. Let me just try an analogy on you. It's not perfect because no analogy is. One of the most upsetting things to me as a citizen educator has been the outburst of anti-Muslim sentiment in this country. And sometimes directed to the president, right? After, the birtherism thing was exposed for what it was, suddenly he became like a closet Muslim, right? And what's really sad to me about that episode is what, so far as I know, the president was never able to do, which is the following. He's never able to get in front of a microphone, so far as I know, and say, look, even though my middle name is Hussein, it turns out I'm not a Muslim, okay? But what if I was?
Yeah.
I don't think he's ever said that, all right? And that tells you something really huge and upsetting about the degree of prejudice in this country, right? That he can't. I'm sure he's thought it a million times, okay? So, what I've started to do is, it turns out I was in the Peace Corps, my dad was in the Peace Corps, knew JFK, I'm the least conservative person in the world. What if I wasn't?
Right.
Right? Why would that be such a terrible thing?
Yep.
The very accusation bespeaks prejudice in the same way. Again, I'm not equating, I'm not saying the prejudice against conservatives on campus is as bad as anti-Muslim prejudice. It isn't. Okay, but I do think there is a parallel there.
But it's a way to let yourself off the hook to listen to you. So it's been funny since the article came out. The critics of the article, one Kate Mann, the one who wrote the New York Times, immediately a conservative Greg Lukianoff and John Haidt, and I'm like, and that's cute. You just want to, but that in the circles you run, that is basically the same thing as saying, oh, by the way, you don't have to listen to them.
Yep. Or you're a pariah.
One thing about campus conservatism that I would note, however, that there are degrees of acceptability in campus conservatism. So what passes for campus conservatism that's acceptable and which is an awful lot of faculty member who self-identify as conservatives, are more on the libertarian-ish end of the spectrum. These are folks who are going to be very socially liberal and are going to have some economic conservative ideas. If you want to really know how accepting a campus is, you're going to have to ask about social conservatism. You know, are the people who, trigger warning, like me, believe that marriage is a union of a man and a woman and that Caitlyn Jenner is still a man? What is the acceptance of that point of view on a college campus? Can you say that without triggering the kind of reaction that might even be worse than the Christakis received at Yale?
We have a real case like that, though. It's at Marquette, and that's one of the reasons why you shouldn't be too confident that you're tenured. And this is a case that I bring up all perfect all the time. So there's a professor, Professor Adams, who for years has been writing this blog saying, I'm a conservative, I teach at Marquette, and I'm afraid of, which is a Catholic institution, that I can't actually give Catholic opinions at this school. This is ridiculous. So there was a student, nobody really clothed themselves in glory in this case, but a student audio taped a discussion with a junior faculty member in training, about whether or not in this debate class they'd be allowed to debate same-sex marriage. And so the student is told that he can't because it would be homophobic to discuss that, it would be offensive to discuss it. So he brings this tape to Professor McAdams, and he looks at, and what he does is he writes what he always writes. It's like, I can't believe you can't even debate same-sex marriage at a Catholic institution. This is ridiculous. So this gets out to Fox News. Unfortunately, you start getting hate mail directed at Marquette, which is never helpful. But what the university ends up doing is they end up firing. McAdams is suing the school, but they're trying to fire a tenured professor because he reported something that was true, and just because the blowback for what he reported was true had such a negative effect on Marquette and that professor that they're now trying to fire him. So
on what grounds, Greg? I'm confused by that. I mean, what's their argument?
Oh, they're always shifting. That's how you know they don't really know. This is totally normal to my experience. I think they're basically at this point settled on, and I do mean settled on, because they were shifting among a professionalism argument.
Oh, that he just didn't fulfill his duties, right, as a professional to agree with somebody else.
Well, the blogging what his professional duty, I think, to the younger professor, I guess, is kind of the argument.
Oh, right, I remember that.
You know,
I mean, look, just to be clear, and Greg's right. I was a little too cute about that. I mean, there are terrible cases in which tenured professors, have their job security threatened, and I feel incredibly lucky that we have people like Greg to help us. But the real crisis, friends, is not with the tenured faculty, and I try to make this point in my book. It's with the adjunct faculty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they got nothing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the other part of the X, right? Why have the full-time faculty gone down, right? Because we're just hiring, when an old geezer like me retires, they hire 4 part-timers at $3,000 a course. That's the biggest scandal in higher ed, friends. It's not like trigger warnings and microaggressions.
All right, we don't have much time left.
Those people got nothing.
I want to make sure I open this up to the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand so I can make sure we get to you. All right, microphones will come here swiftly. Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Joe Freeman. I'm an alumnus of the Berkeley Free Speech Movement. And lurking in the background of our conflict with the administration was a conflict between the administration and the legislature, in particular the California Senate Subcommittee on Un-American Activities, which was trying to get Clark Kerr fired for letting too many subversives into the university. Now, we knew none of this at the time. We just saw the administration as the enemy. I've written a book since then, so I know a lot more. It makes me wonder if there's not something similar going on behind the political correctness of today's universities. You said the administration and the students are on the same side, but is it perhaps true that what is the state legislature doing in this? Is there some equivalent to that? What are the politics behind the politics?
Okay, so the role of government on this is what I refer to as the secret engine of why a lot of these things get so crazy, but it's primarily the Federal Department of Education that's setting standards that are impossible to comply with. And even universities like Tufts University that actually that scoured everything it was supposed to do according to the Department of Education, did basically a textbook version version of every policy they were supposed to have, but got investigated anyway, finally started to stand up saying, like, we can't make you guys happy. There's no amount of reform we can do that can make this Department of Education happy. But that only lasted about a week before the professor was scared back into backing down. However, state legislatures do play a role sometimes too, and actually sometimes they sometimes end up being sort of the more embarrassing kind of grandstandy kind of cases, where there were students at University of Maryland who wanted to show a porno, and the state legislature thought it was a good idea to get involved in that one. That was one where we wrote in explaining that they should not be telling students what they should watch. There was an interesting case out in Oklahoma where Richard Dawkins spoke at University of Oklahoma. They tried to pass a measure saying that evolution is an untested and unpopular theory. We got involved in that one. They backed down.
Well, unpopular, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're right about that.
A University of Tennessee tried to get rid of funding after University of Tennessee had Sex Week on campus. So they're generally sort of social conservative sort of culture war issues, but they're nowhere near, in my experience, the amount of influence as the federal government wields.
And also, let's keep in mind, first of all, I'm delighted that Joe Freeman here, because I've read your work many times over. Something that I actually take a little bit of not pride, but just happiness in is the fact that when David Horowitz went to state legislatures and tried to get them to pass laws saying we have to have ideological balance, which would have been a disaster. And I say that as somebody who wants more ideological balance. We don't want the state legislatures mandating that. He didn't get anywhere, which is a good thing.
That's another question. While the microphone's making its way to you, we have a bunch of questions. I'm sorry I cannot get to all the ones that came online, but several of them are falling into two categories, and I just want to put them on the table in case any of you want to respond. The first is number of conservative, either faculty members, young faculty members, or students worried about coming out on the campus. So they're looking for advice, what to do, what not to do. And then the other one, several questions are flabbergasted that faculty and administrators are allowing students to act as consumers. They want to know, how did that happen and how do we put an end to that?
Let me deal with the first one. In my experience, and I've litigated in an awful lot of places, and I'll be interested to hear Greg's perspective on this. You're safer out of the closet.
Absolutely.
You're absolutely safer. I have dealt with faculty members concerned about tenure, so concerned about tenure and so concerned about people knowing that they're conservative that they would call me and whisper on the phone. And here's the facts. If you are conservative and you have an outstanding record of scholarship, you have an outstanding record of service to your university, and you have you're an excellent teacher, and you're denied tenure and people know you're conservative, oh man, that's like just raising and waving red flags all over the place. But if nobody knows that you're conservative and you're just just another faculty member and you don't get tenure, well, number one, where's your discrimination claim? And number two, it's incredibly difficult to make a discrimination claim. You're just another academic who got frustrated and didn't get what they wanted, and they can go to another university. And similarly with students. Students are safer, I think, actually expressing their point of view. However, you got to have some intestinal fortitude. When I say safer, I mean safer from official sanction, not safer from peer sanction. Right. And that's where it gets really, really rough. And very few students go to college thinking, I cannot wait to get to Harvard and be hated. Yeah. And so that's the issue. That's much worse, because on this issue of being out of the closet, I'm presuming it as protecting you from official sanction.
Yes.
Peer group sanction is a whole, and peer shaming and peer attacks, it's a whole other thing. And you have to be able to withstand that. And that's, I think, a greater free speech threat right now is the self-censoring, because people don't want to confront that kind of peer rejection.
We had a question. Yeah, please. And we got to wrap up quickly, so this might be the last one.
Steve Hayward, currently an inmate at UC Berkeley. As we know, and as Greg mentioned, an awful lot of the ratcheting up, particularly of Title IX, came from guidance from the federal government, not a formal rulemaking, which would never have survived the process. So, sauce for the goose. If President Trump selected any one of you to be Assistant Secretary of Education for Higher Education, what friendly guidance might you direct to universities to begin reversing the administrative corruption that you've described?
I think it's pretty safe to say that none of us would be selected for that. But certainly David, neither of us. I like my day job. But I have plenty of suggestions. One is put your money where your mouth is on that guidance idea, that these letters, basically, that this is rulemaking we're engaged in. If it was amazing that Catherine Lamont was, or someone at the Department of Education was testifying in front of Senator Lamar Alexander. And she managed to say within a couple minutes of each other, one, oh no, we're just engaged in guidance, not rulemaking. But what happens if universities don't follow? Oh, they lose all their federal funding. And it's like, that's rulemaking.
Yeah.
So easiest one would be say this is rulemaking. We need to follow the APA. We need to have guidance and comment, and that will prevent a lot of the wackier stuff from happening. I think they should flat out repeal the 2011 letter. I think that they should leave it up to universities to decide what standard of evidence they want to use, and I think they should adopt the Davis standard for harassment. You can read about it at the Fire. It was even in the Atlantic articles we talk about it all the time. But it's just a definition of harassment that is more like a process of discriminatory action as opposed to a single wrong thing that you would say. So those three things right off the bat.
Yeah, I would say get rid of the 2011 letter. I think that's just due process 101. Mm-hmm. Initiate rulemaking. However, I would also say that rulemaking should remove universities from adjudicating sexual assault entirely. I think that is a criminal matter. I don't think universities are qualified. They do not have the staff. They do not have the means. Let's let the criminal justice system. And then, you know what? If you don't want to bring a criminal complaint, you can bring a civil complaint. You can do a civil action. And then let the university get involved when there's an adjudication that actually occurs.
If I could take a respectful dissent here, and just keep in mind I'm not a lawyer, these two gentlemen are. In fact, except for marrying my wife and joining the Peace Corps, not becoming a lawyer was probably the best decision I ever made. Because if I just laid in the stream, that's where I would be. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but let me just say something about a small point I try to make in the book. It would be great if universities could wash their hands of the adjudication in the way that David is saying. I don't think they can, and here's why. A lot of victims don't want to enlist the criminal justice system in what happened to them. That's just a fact, and that doesn't mean they're not victims, okay? That's point number one. And point number two, for good reasons, the wheels of criminal justice just spin way too slowly. So as much as I would like to say, oh yeah, the universities can't be in the business of judging these things, it's a criminal matter, they should just wash their hands, I do sympathize with university administrators. There's been this episode on campus and these two kids are sitting next to each other. I don't think you can just say to both of them, hey look, this is a criminal matter, okay? 4 years from now, some court will decide your case, and until then, we've got to have the two of you in class next to each other. I don't know what they should do, I'll be honest about that, but they can't do that. I sympathize with them.
Well, you can do no contact and separation orders and things like that, which is very common, for example, in the military. While actual criminal due process unfolds, you can separate people. And you can initiate, judges can craft orders that provide actual sanction if you violate those orders that are far worse than anything that an administrator could do. So there are workarounds to that. Very real concern. I agree completely. If I've claimed that Greg has attacked me, I don't want to be on a panel with him. No. We don't have to do that. There are workarounds from that.
Okay, I did a bad job managing time, so we're at the end. I want to give each of the panelists one last sentence. You can either answer, what is one thing folks in the audience either should be looking for, say in the next year, like a development, or what is one big thing that you think ought to be done on a campus to make a big difference? Want to start?
I've been saying this for my whole career. We have to change expectations. I think that there's a lot of pointing at students and saying, who's telling you to be so anxious and so censorship happy and think that you have a right to be comfortable? Well, I think we are. I think parents are. I think K through 12 is, and I think administrators are. And until we actually start changing the orientation process to say, listen, actually it's a sign that things might be going well if you're made to feel uncomfortable. If we haven't ever said that to students, we shouldn't be surprised that they expect a right to not be offended.
We will take that as the K-12 team at AEI to start to think about that. Thank you.
I would say just very briefly that when universities embrace racial and ethnic diversity, as they should, as they have and they should, they have to take pains to embrace ideological diversity as well, in the same breath. They're not inconsistent. The worst thing that's happened in our landscape now is the idea that a concern for racial and ethnic diversity runs perpendicular to concerns for free speech. Every great warrior for social justice in our history has been a tribune for free speech, because they knew if they don't have that, they got nothing. And so in the same breath as we do and should attend to racial and ethnic diversity and the different problems that come with it, all right, we have to attend to ideological diversity at the same time in the same breath.
Thank you.
So my message would be to conservative students, conservative professors, conservative administrators. I know you have to have some serious intestinal fortitude. Have that intestinal fortitude. You can withstand peer shaming. You can. And in fact, the more of you who demonstrate intestinal fortitude, the less peer shaming there will be, because you will be less isolated, you will be seen as less strange, and more part of campus discourse. And in fact, there's precedent that you should actually take a little bit of joy in it. And I believe the Bible says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you suffer trials of many kinds, including the trial of being a Harvard student."
I mean, if I may say, I mean, you know, some of my students come out to me in their papers, you know, as conservatives, and I'm like, just be yourself. It gets better. You know, don't live a lie. Really, I'm like, we'll all be smarter if you just come out.
Please join me in thanking John, David, and Greg. Great conversation. Thank you, everyone.